In the heart of Europe, thunder began to move not from the sky, but from the march of armies reborn, from shattered empires to triumphant victories. A new order demanded its place in history. This is the March of the Eagles. Europe held its breath as the dawn of 1805 rose over a continent on the brink of transformation. Old powers clung desperately to fading glory, forging coalitions in hopes of preserving a world already slipping from their grasp. But the storm they prepared to confront was unlike any force they had faced before. It was disciplined, relentless, and driven by a vision that sought not merely victory, but supremacy. And as its banners unfurled, each bearing the proud symbol of the eagle, a new era of warfare began. The peace that Europe had tasted was fragile, a thin veil stretched over deep-rooted rivalries and political ambition. Across its cities, whispers grew into warnings. An army was mobilizing with unprecedented speed, precision, and confidence. The first tremors of change began quietly, almost imperceptibly, long before Europe realized what was coming. Across the continent, the old kingdoms clung stubbornly to their traditions, their armies marching with predictable rhythm, their leaders confident that the world would always move at the pace they set. Yet beneath this veneer of stability, a new force was awakening. A force shaped by revolution, honed by discipline, and driven by an ambition that refused to accept the limits of the past. The rise of this force was not the work of a nation alone, but of a new kind of military machine, built with the precision of a clockmaker and the hunger of a predator. The year 1805 marked the moment when Europe first felt the ground shift under its feet. Rumors traveled faster than couriers. A vast army was forming, assembling not in chaos, but in perfect order. It appeared like a miracle of organization corps, moving from distant provinces with unbroken coordination. Cavalry regiments sweeping across plains with the grace of a single living creature. Artillery teams drilling with a speed that defied everything the old monarchs thought possible. Villages watched in awe as columns passed, thousands of boots striking the earth in a relentless rhythm. Those who witnessed it spoke of the same feeling, that something unstoppable had begun to move. This advance was not merely a march, it was a statement. Europe had grown accustomed to slow armies burdened by tradition, weighed down by indecision, their commanders aging relics of a fading world. But what now surged toward the heart of the continent was different, sharp, disciplined, fueled by purpose. It was the embodiment of an age that no longer bowed to kings, but demanded results. Every soldier understood the mission. Every officer knew his place in the vast machinery of war. And as they crossed rivers, mountains, and muddy roads with astonishing speed, one truth became undeniable. A new master of the battlefield was emerging. Old alliances scrambled for relevance. Monarchs whispered warnings to one another, desperate to believe they could contain the rising storm. They formed coalitions, drew borders on maps, and issued proclamations of unity. But each decision they made revealed the same flaw. They were preparing for a kind of war that no longer existed. The world had changed, but they had not. Their armies marched in straight lines. Their commanders relied on outdated tactics. Their soldiers fought according to traditions older than the nations they served. The continent was blind to the revolution unfolding before its eyes. By the time they realized the truth, the march had already begun. Across the Danube, the sound was unmistakable. The rumble of artillery wheels grinding through the soil, the metallic clash of sabers, the distant thunder of hooves cutting through the morning mist. Scouts returned to their commanders pale-faced, describing movements so coordinated they seemed impossible. Massive formations vanished into forests, only to reappear miles away, perfectly aligned, ready to strike. Reports described columns advancing with supernatural speed, bridging rivers overnight, covering distances that should have taken days in mere hours. The coalition leaders dismissed these accounts as exact, but the truth was far more unsettling. The old world was being outpaced at every turn. The campaign opened with a brilliance that stunned the world. While coalitions plotted and kings calculated, This new power struck with the sharpness of lightning. The march toward Austerlitz became a lesson in deception, preparation, and tactical genius. Armies twice its size found themselves outmaneuvered, outhawed, and overwhelmed. The Danube campaign unfolded like a carefully written script. Cities fell not to raw force, but to deception and maneuver. Armies expecting to face a single corps suddenly found themselves surrounded by three. Those who believed they held the advantage discovered that the enemy had anticipated their every move. Bridges collapsed behind them. Supply lines vanished. Morale shattered. The March of the Eagles was no longer a rumor. It was a reality so overwhelming that even seasoned commanders began questioning their understanding of war itself. The first encounters shocked the veterans of Europe. On fields where rigid lines once determined victory, the new force flowed like water, bending, twisting, reforming with instinctive fluidity. Where traditional tactics demanded slow volleys and predictable maneuvers, this new army moved with lightning precision. Infantry surged forward, broke apart, and reassembled as if guided by a single mind. Cavalry swept across the battlefield with terrifying discipline, striking not in wild charges but with calculated purpose. Artillery no longer served as a distant support. It became the beating heart of the battlefield, positioned with mathematical accuracy and unleashed with devastating power. Every encounter, every skirmish, every clash delivered the same message to Europe. The rules had changed. Those who opposed this rising force found themselves not merely defeated but outclassed. Commanders trained in the old doctrines watched helplessly as their carefully designed lines dissolved under pressure they had never imagined. Officers stared in disbelief as their enemy anticipated every movement, countered every plan, exploited every weakness. Soldiers who had once marched proudly under banners of ancient prestige now faced an adversary that seemed to predict their actions before they made them. Yet it was not only military brilliance that drove this unstoppable advance. It was something deeper. A shared belief among the soldiers that they were part of a mission far greater than themselves. They moved with a confidence born from victories already etched in memory. Victories that convinced them their destiny was to sweep aside the old order. Their loyalty was not forced. It was earned. They marched through storms, hunger, and exhaustion without hesitation, knowing that every step was part of a grander design. As the march continued through 1805, the coalition armies grew desperate. They clung to new plans, new formations, new alliances, yet each attempt produced the same outcome. No matter how quickly they reacted, they were always one move behind. Their scouts reported movements they could not track, strategies they could not decipher, formations they could not break. The speed, the coordination, the precision, all of it pointed to a force that had mastered the art of war in a way Europe had never seen. On the frozen fields of December 1805, the sun rose upon a battlefield that would be remembered forever. The sun of Austerlitz, a symbol of dominance forged through intellect and audacity. But triumph did not rest there. The years that followed saw the eagles sweep across Prussia and into the very heart of Eastern Europe. At Jena and Auerstedt, old military traditions crumbled under the weight of innovation and speed. At Friedland, an empire collapsed in a single day, forcing a czar to negotiate terms he once believed unimaginable. Each victory redrew borders, reshaped governments, and silenced the doubts of those who questioned the reach of this rising giant. Yet beneath the glory, Europe sensed a paradox. A power so brilliant it was terrifying, so unstoppable it seemed destined to challenge the limits of human ambition. For every victory inspired AOB, but also fear. How long could one force dominate a continent built upon centuries of rivalry? Between 1805 and 1809, the March of the Eagles became more than a campaign. It became a legend, a movement that altered the map, humbled empires, and forever changed the rhythm of war. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into history, be suited to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories of ambition, conflict, and triumph. See you next time. Villagers who watched the advancing columns spoke of a strange silence that preceded the march. Not the silence of fear, but of certainty as if every soldier knew exactly what was required of him. They described faces hardened by experience, eyes that burned with resolve, and movements so synchronized they seemed choreographed. This was not an army stumbling through Europe. It was an instrument of transformation. In the halls of European courts, panic grew. Maps were redrawn daily as news arrived of cities taken, fortresses bypassed, and armies shattered. The coalition's leaders issued proclamations, boasting of resistance. But behind locked doors, they argued furiously, blaming one another for failures they could not comprehend. They had underestimated a force whose strength lay not only in numbers but in the very structure of its command, flexible, intelligent, and relentless. By late 1805, Europe's balance of power had already begun to collapse. The coalition's greatest cities trembled as reports came of the advancing tide. Every messenger brought the same grim news. The march had not slowed, the momentum had not faltered, and the eagles had not yet reached their final destination. Through mountains and storms, across rivers and valleys, the march continued without hesitation. It was more than a campaign. It was a demonstration of what modern warfare could become when driven by strategy, innovation, and absolute discipline. The old empires watched helplessly as the new order unfolded before them. Their soldiers, brave but outdated, fought valiantly yet were swept aside by something they could neither match nor understand. By the time winter approached, Europe faced a truth it could no longer avoid. A force had risen that could not be ignored, challenged, or contained. Its march signaled not just the advance of an army, but the dawn of a new age, one defined by speed, precision, and intelligence. The eagles were not merely symbols on flags. They were heralds of a transformation that would soon engulf the entire continent. The unstoppable advance had begun, and Europe would never be the same again. The momentum that swept across Europe did not pause, nor did it hesitate. What had begun as a march soon transformed into a masterclass in strategy, reshaping the very nature of warfare. The old generals, accustomed to slow campaigns measured in seasons, now found themselves facing an enemy who measured time in hours. No sooner had one battle ended than preparations for the next had already begun. Armies that once believed themselves invincible discovered that they were playing a game whose rules had been rewritten without their knowledge. This transformation revealed itself most clearly in the campaigns that followed. The march now shifted into something far more profound, a display of mastery that Europe had never witnessed. It was not merely strength that propelled the advance, but intellect sharpened through endless study and a mind that understood the battlefield as though it were a living map. Each river crossing, each mountain pass, each corridor of land was not just terrain, but opportunity. The sweeping movements of divisions looked effortless to the untrained eye, yet behind each maneuver was a calculation honed to the smallest detail. Scouts reported forces appearing in places they had never expected. Armies that believed themselves safe behind natural barriers or fortified positions were suddenly confronted by perfectly coordinated strikes. Entire coalitions were disoriented, confused not only by the speed of the advance, but by the precision with which every attack was executed. It was as though the battlefield itself had chosen a new master, and Europe had no choice but to follow his lead. The campaign leading to the fateful winter of 1805 revealed this mastery most clearly. While coalition forces spread themselves across vast distances, confident that they had cornered their opponent, what they had truly done was leave themselves open to deception. The preparation was subtle, almost invisible. False movements, forged reports, deliberate displays of weakness, each one crafted to lure the coalition into a trap so perfect that even their best advisors could not see the danger unfolding around them. And when the moment finally arrived, it struck with the sharpness of lightning. The morning of the great battle began with a mist so thick it seemed to swallow the landscape. Coalition generals stood convinced that the opposing force was hesitant, weakened by long marches and harsh conditions. Their confidence grew as scouts reported positions that appeared vulnerable, dispersed, and indecisive. But what they had mistaken for weakness was a carefully constructed illusion. Beneath that fog, an army waited in perfect formation, poised to unleash one of the most devastating maneuvers in the history of warfare. The rising sun revealed the truth. In the hours that followed, disciplined ranks moved with such coordination that it seemed as if the earth itself had shifted beneath the coalition. Commands echoed across the fields with unwavering certainty. Formations pivoted with mechanical precision, cutting through enemy lines that had expected vulnerability but instead found a wall of unstoppable determination. The day became a masterpiece of military execution, a symphony of strategy where every movement complemented the next. From that moment, Europe understood that it was witnessing not merely victory, but mastery. The battle became the symbol of an era point at which old doctrines were shattered and new ones forged in fire. What made it extraordinary was not the number of soldiers, nor the weight of the artillery, but the mind behind it. A mind capable of seeing the battlefield from above, of predicting movement before it occurred, of shaping the flow of combat as if directing a grand theater. The coalition's defeat was not simply a military failure. It was a realization that they were facing a new form of war. In the years that followed, the march continued its relentless progression across Europe. Prussia, once proud and confident in its military tradition, found itself facing a whirlwind it could neither contain nor comprehend. The proud armies that had dominated Europe's fields for generations suddenly collapsed with shocking speed. Battles that should have lasted days were decided in hours. Fortresses that once stood indomitable fell after brief resistance. Every encounter demonstrated the same pattern. While the enemy relied on tradition, the advancing force relied on adaptability, intelligence, and unwavering resolve. Nowhere was this more evident than on the plains where two great battles were fought on the same day. The world watched in disbelief as two armies, each larger than any one force facing them, were dismantled with almost clinical efficiency. The brilliance of the maneuvers lay not in brutality, but in precision. Cavalry units cut off retreating lines before they could reorganize. Infantry advanced in well-timed waves, allowing no opportunity for artillery thundered not randomly but with mathematical intention, each shot contributing to a pattern that closed around the enemy like a tightening noose. The collapse of a once powerful kingdom seemed unthinkable, yet it unfolded with a speed that shocked even its allies. Its rulers, stunned by the magnitude of their defeat, struggled to understand how their centuries-old military system could crumble so quickly. They had relied on reputation, tradition, and rigid structures, none of which mattered against an opponent who valued flexibility, innovation, and momentum above all else. By the time negotiations began, the lesson was clear. Europe was no longer in the age of kings who relied on inherited power. It had entered an age defined by intellect and decisiveness, where victory belonged to those who could adapt to the shifting demands of war. The March of the Eagles was not simply overpowering armies. It was redefining the meaning of power itself. But the mastery did not end at the battlefield's edge. The campaign extended into the realm of diplomacy, reshaping the continent's political landscape with the same precision that had dominated its military engagements. Treaties were rewritten, alliances shattered, borders redrawn. Leaders who once boasted of their influence now found themselves standing uncertain, unsure whether to resist or submit. Some chose to fight and were crushed. Others chose to negotiate and found themselves bound to terms they could hardly comprehend. The world they had once known was disappearing beneath their feet. This transformation reached its pinnacle in the events that followed the sweeping victories in the East. An empire that had stood proud for centuries, claiming dominion over vast lands and countless people, found itself humbled on a battlefield lined with forests and rivers. A force long feared for its size and endurance faltered under the weight of relentless strategy. The defeat was decisive, not only in military terms, but in its psychological impact. A monarch who had once spoken with unwavering confidence now found himself forced into negotiations he had never imagined entertaining. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of military genius and historical transformation as fascinating as we do, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It helps us bring more of these incredible moments from history to you. We'll see you in the next one. The meeting that followed became symbolic of a new European order. Two leaders stood on a raft anchored in the middle of a river, one representing the old world, the other, the unstoppable march of the new. The river beneath them was calm, but the world around them was not. The treaty that emerged from that meeting reshaped the entire political map, transforming bitter rivals into reluctant partners, and cementing a dominance that would ripple across the continent for years to come. But still, the march did not slow. Between 1805 and 1809, the mastery displayed on battlefield after battlefield created a momentum that seemed completely unstoppable. Governments rose and fell in the wake of advancing columns. Cities that had once been defiant now greeted their occupiers with resignation, or in some cases, even admiration. The very idea of resistance seemed futile against a force that was capable of predicting, owed mano-bearing and overwhelming any opposition thrown its way. Every campaign revealed another layer of strategic brilliance. There was the ability to strike where least expected, a talent for turning disadvantage into opportunity, and a discipline that held firm even under the harshest conditions. The march became not just a physical advance across Europe, but a psychological one. It inspired awe in some, deep fear in many, and a grudging respect in all. The mastery of these years wasn't defined by victory alone, but by transformation. The continent was no longer a mosaic of isolated kingdoms clinging to ancient traditions. It was becoming a grand theater where innovation dominated, where leadership demanded intellect, and where the eagle soared higher with every single triumph. As the years advanced toward 1809, the world sensed that this relentless march was entering a new phase. This one would challenge old alliances, test empires, and push the very limits of power itself. The victories across Europe had reshaped not only the map, but the imagination of nations. They revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Power was no longer measured by ancient lineage or the weight of tradition. It was now measured by the speed, the intelligence, and the coordination of armies that moved like a single, breathing organism. Yet as the dust settled over the defeated plains and the echoes of past battles faded into memory, a different kind of struggle began to emerge. This struggle reached deeper than borders or treaties. It was a confrontation between an idea that sought to remake Europe entirely, and the old world determined to resist it at all costs. The continent, exhausted yet restless, found itself being reshaped at a pace it could barely comprehend. Former adversaries were compelled into uneasy cooperation, while old rivals forged new alliances out of sheer necessity rather than any sense of trust. Still, the march continued, driven not only by ambition but by an unyielding belief that the future belonged to those who dared to challenge the boundaries of possibility. As new governments were installed, sweeping reforms introduced, and institutions transformed, the message was clear. Europe was being reorganized according to a vision that would either unify it or ignite it entirely. Yet even as diplomatic envoys scrambled, kings negotiated in whispers, and ministers attempted to salvage the fragments of their fading authority, one region remained defiant. This resistance didn't come from the great powers of the East or the fractured coalitions of the North. Instead, it rose from a kingdom that had long considered itself the guardian of tradition, honor, and pride, a kingdom that believed it alone carried the legacy of ancient warriors. It was here, in the heart of Central Europe, that the March of the Eagles would face its next great test. The challenge came with thunderous confidence, declared through proclamations that spread across Europe like wildfire. A call to arms echoed through cities and countryside alike, insisting that no throne, No nation, no legacy could bow to the sweeping force that had dominated the continent. Prussian pride, forged through centuries of military discipline, became the banner under which an entire nation its generals, steeped in old doctrines and classical drills, believed they were prepared to confront this rising power. Their soldiers, drilled in rigid lines and unbending formations, believed they represented the last defense against a force that threatened the old order itself. But confidence built on past glories is often blind to the realities of the present. What they faced was not an army bound by tradition, nor one reliant on the predictable movements of conventional warfare. Instead, they encountered a force that had mastered speed as a weapon, deception as a shield, and innovation as a decisive advantage. It advanced not in rigid lines, but in coordinated waves, unpredictable, fluid, and deadly efficient. When the collision finally came, it wasn't simply a battle of armies. It was a clash between a centuries-old military philosophy and a new style of warfare that would change the world forever. Near the twin towns of Jena and Austerlitz, the storm erupted. The landscape, dotted with forests, rolling fields, and narrow pathways, became a stage for one of the most dramatic and decisive encounters Europe had ever witnessed. The Prussian commanders, confident in their numerical strength and convinced of their moral superiority, prepared to deliver what they believed would be a shattering blow. They expected a predictable advance, a cautious approach, a methodical march. What they received instead was a lightning strike. Columns moved with breathtaking coordination, emerging from the morning mist like specters of war. Scouts swept through forests, infantry advanced in dispersed formations, and cavalry thundered across the fields with a speed that defied all expectation. Orders flew from one division to another with astonishing precision. It was as though every single soldier understood not only his own role but the role of the entire army. Against this fluidity, the Prussian rigidity crumbled. Within hours, the battlefield descended into chaos. Lines that were meant to stand firm buckled under relentless pressure. Units attempting to redeploy found themselves outmaneuvered at every single turn. Communication collapsed, morale faltered, and the once proud army that had claimed to be the heir to Frederick the Great found itself completely overwhelmed. The defeat was so swift, so total, that it stunned the capitals of Europe. In a matter of days, an entire kingdom's military prestige lay shattered upon the fields of Thuringia. The retreat that followed was not a controlled withdrawal, but a desperate, panicked flight. Roads were clogged with soldiers, carts, and officers who had once marched with their heads held high. Fortresses, once confident in their strength, surrendered with little to no resistance. In city after city, the Eagles advanced with a momentum that appeared unstoppable. It was not only a military collapse, but a psychological one, a stark realization that the world had changed faster than they had adapted. As the army swept through Prussia's heartland, the very symbols of its authority fell. The capital, once believed to be inviolable, opened its gates. The royal court fled eastward in panic. Archives, treasures, and relics of a kingdom that prided itself on discipline and tradition were abandoned in the haste to escape. This was not merely conquest. It was the dismantling of an old order, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the echo of what once had been. Yet even in victory, the march did not slow. The force that had just crushed Prussia turned its eyes eastward, sensing that the final obstacle to complete dominance of the continent lay just ahead. Beyond the frozen rivers and snow-covered forests stood an empire vast, resilient, and unpredictable. It commanded immense resources. It had legions of soldiers hardened by harsh climates, and it was ruled by a sovereign who refused to be intimidated. If Europe was to be reshaped entirely, then its eastern titan would have to be confronted head-on. The advance into this new frontier brought challenges unlike any faced before. The terrain was harsher, the distances longer, the logistics far more complex. Winter winds cut through the ranks with merciless ferocity, turning simple marshes into brutal tests of endurance. But even in these conditions, the march maintained its relentless rhythm. Columns pressed onward toward a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of nations but the very direction of history. The encounter near Friedland became the defining moment. The battlefield, bordered by rivers and dense woods, forced both sides into a deadly arena from which only one could emerge victorious. The opposing army, determined to halt the advance once and for all, deployed with precision, confident that the terrain favored their defense. But what they had not anticipated was the speed at which the advancing forces adapted to the landscape, turning every obstacle into a tactical opportunity. The battle that day would be the final, bloody punctuation mark on this chapter of European history. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. See you in the next one. Between 1805 and 1809, Europe witnessed a military phenomenon unlike any it had ever seen. The continent became a vast chessboard, and on it, one army moved with a precision and ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. This was the era of the Grande Armée, the March of the Eagles, a period that would fundamentally reshape the balance of power and leave an indelible mark on history. So, how did one force manage to bring an entire continent to its knees in just a few short years? Let's dive into the story of one of history's most dominant military campaigns. The story begins in a Europe of ancient monarchies and shifting alliances, a system that had been in place for centuries. But this old order was about to be shattered. The machine of war that emerged was a perfect storm of innovation, strategy, and sheer will. At its heart was the Corsus Systema revolutionary concept that divided the massive army into smaller, self-sufficient mini-armies. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery, allowing it to operate independently or combine with others to deliver a knockout blow. This flexibility was unheard of. While other armies moved as single, lumbering entities, this new force could spread out, march faster, live off the land, and converge on the enemy from multiple directions, keeping them constantly off balance and guessing. Then there was the artillery. Cannon technology was refined to become more mobile and more deadly. Instead of just softening up targets from a distance, cannons were now brought right up to the front lines, creating what was known as the Grand Battery. Imagine a wall of cannon fire blasting holes directly into the enemy's infantry squares, creating chaos and panic just moments before the final attack. This wasn't just support fire. It was a key offensive weapon, a brutal and effective tool for breaking the enemy's will to fight. And leading the charge was the cavalry, not just scouts, but heavy shock. Troops cuirassiers, clad in steel breastplates thundering across the battlefield. Their purpose was simple: to smash through any infantry or cavalry that dared to stand in their way. A well-timed cavalry charge could turn the tide of a battle, transforming a stalemate into a rout. Combining these elements was a strategic doctrine that was both simple and brilliant. T, manœuvre, sor, les, dairy, res, or the move on the enemy's rear. The goal was to pin the enemy est front with a smaller force, while the main army swept around their flank, cutting off their lines of supply and retreat. Suddenly, an opposing army would find itself trapped, surrounded, with no choice but to fight a battle on terms they didn't choose or surrender. This strategy, executed with lightning speed, led to some of the most decisive victories in military history. It was a deadly dance of deception, speed, and overwhelming force. The year 1805 gave us the textbook example of this system in action. The ULM campaign. An Austrian army of over 70,000 men under General Mack positioned themselves in Bavaria, expecting a direct assault. They fortified their positions, confident in their defensive strategy. But they were playing an old game. Instead of a head-on clash, the Grande Armée, moving with incredible speed, bypassed them completely. They poured through the Black Forest, sweeping north and then east, completely enveloping Mac's forces before he even realized what was happening. His supply lines were cut. His escape routes were blocked, trapped, and outmaneuvered, with barely a shot fired in a major battle. Mac was forced to surrender his entire army. It was a strategic masterpiece, a victory won not primarily through brute force, but through superior movement and intellect. Just weeks after the triumph at Ulm, the stage was set for what is often called the perfect battle. Facing a combined force of Austrians and Russians, the army appeared to be in a vulnerable position. They were outnumbered and seemed to be stretching their lines thin. The Allied commanders saw an opportunity. They planned to attack the seemingly weak right flank, roll up the line, and cut off the retreat. But this was exactly the trap that had been laid for them. The weak flank was a deliberate bait. As the Allies committed their forces to the attack, a massive, previously hidden French force surged forward to occupy the high ground they had just abandoned, the Pratzen Heights. From this dominant position, they could now fire down upon the Allied center and rear. The Allied army was split in two. Its attack on the flank stalled, and its center collapsed under the pressure. What followed was a complete rout. The Russian army was shattered. In a single day, the Third Coalition was broken. The Battle of the Three Emperors, as it came to be known, was a tactical masterclass that sent shockwaves across Europe. It wasn't just a victory. It was an annihilation. With Austria humbled, a new challenger stepped forward. Prussia. The Prussian army had a fearsome reputation, built on the legacy of Frederick the Great. They were confident, disciplined, and believed their infantry was the best in the world. In 1806, they went to war. The clash came at the twin battles of Jena and Austerlitz, fought on the same day. At Jena, the main Prussian force was decisively defeated, but the real shock came at Austerlitz, where a single French corps under Marshal Davout, heavily outnumbered, faced and defeated the bulk of the Prussian army, including their king and their most celebrated commanders. The myth of Prussian invincibility was shattered in a single afternoon. The aftermath was a relentless pursuit that saw the once proud Prussian army disintegrate. Fortresses surrendered without a fight. The entire kingdom collapsed in a matter of weeks. The Eagles had now humbled two of Europe's great powers. The war then moved east into Poland to confront the last major continental power still standing, Russia. The fighting here was different. The winter of 1807 was brutal, the terrain was difficult, and the Russian soldiers were incredibly tough and resilient. The Battle of Eylau was a horrific, bloody stalemate fought in a snowstorm, with staggering casualties on both sides. It was a grim reminder that victory was not always easy or clean. But that summer, at the Battle of Friedland, another decisive victory was achieved, using a combination of artillery, infantry, and cavalry. The Russian army was trapped against a river and systematically destroyed. With his army defeated, Tsar Alexander I had no choice but to sue for peace. The resulting treaties of Tilsit, signed on a raft in the middle of a river, represented the absolute zenith of this military empire. France and Russia became allies, carving up Europe between them. The continental system, an economic blockade against Britain, was now imposed across the continent. The March of the Eagles was complete. From 1805 to 1809, this military force had redrawn the map of Europe. It had dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, a 1,000-year-old institution. It had humbled Austria, crushed Prussia, and forced Russia into an alliance. Old kingdoms were swept away, replaced by new ones ruled by family and loyal marshals. An empire that stretched from Spain to Poland now dominated the continent. This wasn't just a series of military victories. It was a political, social, and cultural revolution imposed by the force of arms. The principles of the French Revolution, meritocracy, legal reform, and centralized administration were exported across the conquered territories, whether they were wanted or not. The old world of aristocratic privilege and feudal obligations was being forcibly dismantled. But this unprecedented dominance came at a cost. The constant warfare drained resources and manpower. The occupation of foreign lands bred resentment and fueled the fires of nationalism. Spain rose up in a brutal guerrilla war, a bleeding ulcer that tied down hundreds of thousands of troops. And in 1809, Austria, having reformed its army, tried its luck again. Though ultimately defeated at the Battle of Wagram, the Austrians inflicted heavy casualties and showed that the Eagles were not invincible. The victory was hard-won and lacked the decisive brilliance of Austerlitz or Jena. The system was beginning to show signs of strain. The seemingly unstoppable force had stretched itself to its limits. The incredible rise from 1805 to 1809 was a testament to a revolutionary military system and the strategic genius that guided it. It was a whirlwind of conquest that left Europe transformed. But as the smoke cleared, new questions emerged. How long could such dominance be maintained? How long before the conquered peoples of Europe, inspired by their own sense of national identity, would rise up? The very success of the campaigns had sown the seeds of their own destruction. The empire had reached its peak, and from the highest point, there was only one way to go. The next chapter of European history would be defined not by the march of the eagles, but by the continent's struggle to free itself from their shadow. The story of this incredible military machine is a powerful lesson in both the art of war and the fragile nature of power itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments which historical campaign you'd like to see covered next. Until next time.